Hey, somebody call 911. This woman is dying. Annie's voice rang across the sidewalk, bright and urgent against the dull morning hum of the city. Ma'am, she asked, leaning down. Can you hear me? Ma'am, can you hear what I'm saying? The woman lay near the curb in a heap of wrinkled fabric and exhaustion. One cheek turned toward the pavement, one arm bent under her side. Her coat was dusty. Her hair, once pinned back with care, had fallen loose around her face. Then her eyelids stirred. Annie leaned closer, her face tightening with focus. The woman's eyes opened to narrow slits, cloudy and unfixed. Her lips moved before any sound came out, as though speech itself had become too heavy. I hear. Okay, Annie said, steadying her own voice. Okay, that's good. Don't go back to sleep. Annie looked up at the passing adults. Please, Annie called, lifting her voice again. Please help her. Somebody call 911. A man in a faded brown jacket glanced over and kept walking. A woman carrying a takeout bag gave Annie one quick look and then turned her head away as if the sight itself might delay her day. Two younger women standing outside a corner store exchanged a look that was all dismissal. One of them jerked her chin toward the woman on the ground. That's the same one from earlier. The other snorted. Yeah, she was over there arguing with those homeless women near the church food truck. As they spoke, a couple of people slowed down near the curb, not out of concern, but curiosity. One middle-aged man in steel-toe boots stepped closer, squinting down. She was causing a scene, he said. Saw her myself standing there with those homeless ladies like she belonged to the whole mess. Before Annie could say anything, another man came alongside him and nudged the woman's shoe with the side of his boot. Not brutally, but carelessly, with the kind of disrespect that assumed no consequences. Hey, Annie said sharply, turning toward him. Don't do that. The man barely acknowledged her. People fake this all the time, kid. He prodded at the woman's ankle again. Lie there long enough. Somebody feels sorry for you. The woman reacted this time. Not much. Just a weak twitch in her leg and a strained breath through parted lips. But Annie saw it and so did the men. She's not pretending, Annie said. She talked to me. One of the women from the store folded her arms. Well, she wasn't quiet earlier. Picked a fight with those other women over food, then got herself knocked down. That's what happens. The words landed hard. Annie looked from one face to the next and found nothing in them that resembled pity. The woman on the ground let out another faint breath. Annie looked down and saw her shiver. Without overthinking it, Annie shrugged off her own little jacket. The cold bit into her arms at once, but she ignored it. She spread the jacket over the woman's chest and tucked it around her shoulders with the tender practicality of a child who had spent enough time around sickness to know warmth mattered. Done, Annie murmured. This will be better. The woman's eyes fluttered again. She seemed to feel the jacket to register Annie's nearness. Her gaze drifted upward toward Annie's face, unfocused, but trying. What your name? She whispered. Annie blinked. Annie. The woman swallowed with visible effort. Annie. She paused, breathing shallowly. Where you live? Annie hesitated, surprised by the question. Just a few blocks from here. The woman's fingers twitched against the concrete. Whose child? I'm my mama's, Annie said softly, almost instinctively. Her name is Denise. The woman looked at her as if she were trying to memorize every answer. Good girl, she breathed, though the words nearly vanished in the wind. Annie looked up again. Please, she called. She needs help, now. No one moved. One man shrugged and said, Kid, I told you she was just fighting with those other women a little while ago. Another added, they were kicking at her legs and yelling at her near the shelter line. Whole thing looked messy. Best stay out of it. Stay out of it. Annie had heard grown-ups say that about all kinds of things. Trouble, police, neighbors' arguments, anything ugly enough that people wanted permission not to care. She rose to her feet. Her eyes landed on the old public pay phone by the bus bench. Its metal frame scarred with graffiti, its receiver hanging stiff and dull against the box. People barely used payphones anymore, but it was there, and it worked often enough for the neighborhood. "I'm calling," Annie said more to herself than to anyone else. She ran to the phone, dug the coins from her coat pocket, and pushed them in with clumsy, shaking fingers. The line rang, once, twice. Then a bored female voice answered. 911. "What is your emergency?" "There's a lady on the sidewalk and she can't get up," Annie said in a rush. "She was on the ground when I found her and people won't help and I think she's dying." A beat of silence. Then the operator's tone shifted. Not concerned but skeptical. "Honey, where are your parents?" "My mom is sick. Please send somebody," Annie said. "Is this a prank call?" The woman asked flatly. "Because if you're playing on this line, that's serious." Annie gripped the receiver tighter. "No, ma'am, I'm not playing. She talked to me, but she can't move." Another pause. Paper shuffling in the background. Then, maddeningly, "You need an adult to call if there's really an emergency." "I am telling you it is an emergency." But the line had already gone cold with the kind of indifference that sounded almost professional. Annie stared at the receiver for one stunned second, then slammed it back harder than she meant to. She turned toward the sidewalk again. The woman was still there. The crowd had thinned, not because the problem was solved, but because people had grown bored with it. Annie ran back and dropped to her knees beside the woman once more. "I tried," she said under her breath, more as a promise than an apology. Then she lifted her head and scanned the sidewalk with fierce determination. "Please," she said to the next person who passed, a broad-shouldered man in a dark hoodie carrying a tool bag. "Please help me call 911. They didn't believe me." The man slowed. He looked first at Annie, then at the woman on the ground, then at the jacket wrapped around her. Something in his face changed. "They didn't believe you?" he asked. Annie shook her head. "They thought I was joking." He muttered something under his breath that Annie was too young to repeat. Then he crouched beside her, not too close to frighten the woman, but close enough to see what Annie had seen. "This ain't no joke," he said grimly. He pulled a phone from his pocket and dialed. This time, his voice came low and firm, the voice of a grown man already irritated enough to be taken seriously. "I need an ambulance," he said. "Now. Woman down on South Halsted near the old laundromat. She's semi-conscious. Can't stand. Looks like she was knocked around. And no, I'm not guessing." He listened, gave the exact corner, then hung up. "They're coming," he told Annie for the first time since she sat down on that sidewalk. Annie allowed herself one slow breath. The woman's eyes opened again, only halfway, but enough to search for Annie. Annie leaned close so she would not have to look far. "Help's coming," Annie said. The woman's lips trembled. "Annie." "Yes, ma'am," Annie answered. The man with the tool bag stayed crouched beside Annie for another moment, watching the woman's shallow breathing as if he no longer trusted the street to tell the truth. He looked to be somewhere in his 40s, with tired eyes and the rough hands of somebody who worked for every dollar he brought home. His beard had more gray in it than black, and there was a plain wedding band on his finger, scratched and worn from years of labor. "You did good, little one," he said quietly. "Most grown folks wouldn't have done half of what you did." Annie did not answer right away. She kept her eyes on the woman's face, watching the rise and fall of her chest under the jacket. The stranger's breathing still sounded too weak, too uneven. Annie knew enough about sickness to recognize when a body was struggling. You sure they're coming? She asked. They're coming, the man said. Now that they heard a grown man's voice. They're coming fast. There was no bitterness in the way he said it, but there was something close to it. Annie looked up at him then. What's your name, sir? She asked. Name's Earl, he said. You, Annie. Well, Annie, I'm going to stay right here till the ambulance gets here. She nodded once. That helped more than she expected. The woman on the ground stirred again, though only faintly. Her mouth moved, then stopped. Annie leaned down, careful not to crowd her. It's Annie, she said softly, as though continuing a conversation that had never properly begun. You asked me before, Annie, and help's coming. The woman's eyes cracked open for half a second, unfocused, but searching. She seemed to settle a little when she heard Annie's voice. Her hand twitched against the pavement, and Annie reached out instinctively, resting her fingers over it, just enough to be felt. The woman's skin was still cold, but no longer abandoned. Earl noticed Annie staring after the people who passed without slowing down. Don't waste your eyes on them, he said, rising slowly to his feet. Most folks learned a long time ago how to keep their conscience from slowing down their mourning. Annie frowned. Why? Earl gave a quiet, almost humorless huff because if they stopped for every hurting person in this city, they'd have to admit how many there are. That was too large a thought for Annie to fully carry. But she tucked it away all the same. A fresh gust of wind came down the block. And only then did Annie remember she had no jacket on. The cold bit through the sleeves of her faded dress. She rubbed her bare arms once. More out of habit than complaint, Earl noticed. You gave her your coat. She said she was cold. He looked at Annie for a long second and something in his face softened. Yeah, he said, I guess she did. Annie's fingers crept into her pocket and closed around the folded prescription. The paper had gone warm from being held so long. That single touch brought her mother back into the front of her mind with painful force. Denise on the couch under the quilt, skin shining with fever, trying not to cough because it made her whole body hurt. Annie had promised to be quick. Straight there and straight back. Those were the instructions. Instead, she had stopped and stayed. And now, every passing minute pressed on her chest. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments about where you are watching from. And if you believe kindness still matters in this world, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. She looked down at the slip, then toward the pharmacy 3 blocks farther up, then back toward the woman on the ground. Earl followed her gaze. You got somewhere you're supposed to be. Annie hesitated, then nodded. My mama sent me for medicine. How sick is she? She had fever all night. Couldn't get up much this morning. Annie swallowed. I was supposed to go get it and come home. Earl's expression changed again, turning thoughtful now. And you still stopped? Annie lowered her eyes. I couldn't just leave her. No, he said. You couldn't. The woman on the sidewalk tried to shift and a strange little sound escaped her throat. Annie turned back immediately. Don't move, she said, the way she had heard nurses say it on television. Just stay still, okay. The woman's breathing hitched. Her lips formed something that might have been a question, but the effort seemed to tire her before sound came. Earl took a step into the street and scanned both directions, listening. There were sirens somewhere far off. But in Chicago, that did not mean much. Sirens belong to the city the way pigeons and broken glass did. Come on, he muttered under his breath. Don't make this child wait out here all day. Annie glanced up at him again. Do you think she has kids? Earl looked down at the woman, surprised by the question. Why you ask that? Because she asked whose child I was. Annie frowned as if still trying to sort through the meaning of it. Maybe only people with children ask that. Earl considered it. Maybe. Or maybe she just wanted to know somebody in the world was attached to you. Makes a difference. A pair of office workers approached from the corner, both holding lidded coffee cups. One of them slowed when he saw Earl standing guard over the scene. "M's on the way?" he asked. "Supposed to be," Earl said. The man nodded, glanced at Annie, then at the woman, and moved on. His companion did not even pause. Annie watched them go and said he could have helped, too. "Could have," Earl agreed. "Didn't." A patrol car rolled through the intersection and kept going. A sanitation truck clattered behind it. The sky remained the same dull pewter color, threatening rain. But withholding it, the whole morning felt suspended between one thing and another. Annie shifted her weight on the pavement and looked again toward the pharmacy. "If I go now," she said slowly. "What if she thinks I left?" Earl crouched beside her again so he would not have to speak down to her. "Listen to me. You already did the brave part. Nobody can take that from you. But you got a sick mama at home, too. And that matters. Sometimes being a good person means figuring out who needs you most in the next 5 minutes." Annie's eyes moved back to the woman. That was the trouble though, right now. It felt like the answer was both. As if sensing the tension inside her, the woman's fingers moved weakly beneath Annie's hand. Annie leaned closer. "I'm still here," she said. The woman's eyelids fluttered. "Annie," she whispered again, barely audible. Before she could say so, the distant siren Earl had been straining to hear grew louder, then sharper, then turned onto their block. Earl exhaled. "There we go." The ambulance came fast, lights strobing across the wet street and shop windows, turning the whole block briefly blue and red. 2 paramedics jumped out before the vehicle fully settled at the curb, both in dark uniforms, movements brisk and practiced. One was a tall woman with silver at her temples and a face that looked carved from competence. The other was younger, broad-shouldered, carrying a red trauma bag and a folded stretcher. "What do we got?" the older paramedic asked as she dropped to one knee. Earl answered first. "Adult female. Found down. Semi-conscious. Little girl here's been with her." The paramedic's eyes flicked to Annie, then to the coat around the woman. "That your jacket, sweetheart?" Annie nodded. The woman's expression softened for only a second. "All right, you did good." Then she went to work. The younger paramedic knelt by the woman's legs while his partner checked her breathing, her pulse, her responsiveness. Questions came quickly, professionally. "What's your name, ma'am? Can you open your eyes for me? Do you know where you are?" The woman tried. Annie could see that much. But the answers, if she had them, were trapped too far inside. The older paramedic looked over her shoulder. "Did anyone see her fall?" Nobody spoke. Earl placed a steady hand on Annie's shoulder. "You need to go get that medicine now," he said quietly. "I'll tell them what you did." Annie looked from him to the woman on the ground, now surrounded by motion and uniforms and the sharp smell of antiseptic. For the first time all morning, she believed the stranger might live. She stood slowly, her legs stiff from the cold sidewalk, and smoothed the wrinkled prescription slip in her hand. Then, before she stepped away, she bent down one last time so the woman might still hear her through the noise. "My name is Annie," she said gently. "I'm going to get my mama's medicine now." The woman did not open her eyes, but her mouth moved as though repeating that name one more time. Then Annie turned toward the pharmacy and started walking faster with every step. While behind her, the siren lights flashed across the city like a warning nobody should have needed in the first place. Annie walked faster than she ever had before, her small legs trying to keep pace with the urgency pounding in her chest. The sound of the ambulance behind her faded into the background, swallowed by the city's constant noise. But it didn't leave her entirely. It lingered like an echo, like something unfinished. She kept glancing back over her shoulder at first, half expecting to see the woman sitting up, calling after her again. But the street had already begun to close over the moment, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The pharmacy sat on the corner 3 blocks up, its green sign flickering slightly even in the daylight. Annie pushed through the glass door, and a small bell chimed overhead. The warmth inside hit her instantly, along with the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic mixed with something faintly sweet, maybe cough syrup or bubble gum flavored medicine. Behind the counter, a middle-aged pharmacist in a white coat was typing something into a computer. He didn't look up right away. 2 customers stood in line ahead of Annie, both older, both moving at the unhurried pace of people who had nowhere urgent to be. Annie stepped in behind them, clutching the prescription in both hands now. Her fingers were still cold, her arms bare without her jacket. She shifted from foot to foot, her eyes darting toward the door, then back to the counter, then down at the paper again. Everything felt slower inside the store, like time had stretched in a way that didn't match the urgency outside. She could still hear the woman's voice in her head. "What? Your name?" "Annie," she whispered under her breath as if answering again. The first customer finished, then the second. Finally, the pharmacist looked up and noticed her. "Next," he said. Annie stepped forward quickly and pushed the paper across the counter. "My mama needs this, please. She's real sick." The man adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the prescription. "All right, let me take a look here." His voice was calm, routine, practiced. He typed something into the system, then nodded once. "Give me a few minutes." "A few minutes," Annie repeated, her voice tightening. "Yes, ma'am, we have to fill it." Annie swallowed. A few minutes felt like too much. Everything about the morning had taught her that waiting could cost something real. But she didn't argue. She just nodded and stepped back, watching his hands move with careful precision as he gathered bottles, counted pills, printed labels. Behind her, the door chimed again as someone entered. Annie turned her head slightly, instinctively, the way she had been doing all morning. A woman in a heavy coat walked in, followed by a man talking loudly on his phone. Their lives seemed untouched by anything Annie had just witnessed. She looked down at her bare arms again. Without her jacket, she felt smaller, somehow, more exposed. She rubbed her hands together and tried to focus. The pharmacist returned with a small white bag and set it on the counter. "That'll be $12.60. Annie froze. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded bills her mother had given her. 2 ones, a 5, a few coins. She counted them carefully on the counter, her lips moving silently. It wasn't enough. Her chest tightened. I thought it was 10. The pharmacist glanced at the register, then back at her. "Price went up on this one." Annie stared at the money. For a second, the world felt like it had tilted again, just like it had on the sidewalk. "My mama really needs it," she said, her voice quieter now. "She's got a fever and she can't get up." The pharmacist hesitated. He looked at Annie a little more closely this time, noticing the lack of a coat, the worry in her eyes, the way her fingers hovered protectively over the money as if it were all she had. "Do you have anything else?" he asked. Annie shook her head. There was a brief pause, the kind that stretches longer than it should. Then the man behind her, the one who had come in talking on his phone's side, reached into his wallet and set a few bills on the counter. "Just ring it up," he said, not looking at Annie. She turned, startled. "I thank you." He waved it off, already turning back to his call. Yeah, I'm at the pharmacy." "Hold on a second," he muttered into the phone as if helping her was nothing more than a small interruption. The pharmacist nodded, finished the transaction, and handed Annie the bag. "Make sure she takes it with food," he said. And keep her hydrated. Annie held the bag carefully like it might break. Yes, sir. She turned and hurried out the door, the bell chiming again as she stepped back into the cold. The city felt different now. Not quieter, not kinder, just heavier. She walked faster this time, almost running. The medicine clutched tight against her chest. Every step felt like it mattered again. Her mind bounced between two places, her mother on the couch waiting, and the woman on the sidewalk surrounded now by strangers in uniforms. She reached her building, a narrow, aging structure with chipped paint and a front door that stuck unless you pulled it just right. She pushed inside, the familiar smell of old carpet and cooking oil greeting her like something steady in an unsteady day. "Mom," she called as she climbed the stairs. No answer. Her heart jumped, but then she heard a faint cough from inside the apartment. Annie pushed the door open. Denise was still on the couch, wrapped in the quilt, her skin flushed, her eyes half closed. She turned her head slightly when Annie entered. "You back," she murmured. "I got it," Annie said quickly, moving to her side. "I got the medicine." She helped her mother sit up just enough, poured a glass of water from the kitchen sink, and handed her the pills the way the pharmacist had instructed. Denise swallowed them slowly, wincing a little, then leaned back again. "You took your time," she said gently, not accusing, just tired. Annie hesitated. She thought about the sidewalk. The people who walked past, the men who kicked the woman's leg, the voice on the phone that didn't believe her. "Earl, the ambulance. I had to help somebody," Annie said finally. Denise opened her eyes a little more. "You okay?" Annie nodded. "Yeah." She wasn't. Her mother studied her face for a moment, reading more than Annie had said. Then she reached out and touched her cheek. Her hand still warm despite the fever. "You did right," Denise whispered. Those 3 words settled something inside Annie that had been shaking all morning. She sat there beside her mother, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing as the medicine began to do its work. Outside, the city continued like it always did. Loud, restless, indifferent. But Annie knew something now she hadn't fully understood before. People could walk past. They could look away. They could decide someone didn't matter. But that didn't mean they were right. And somewhere across the neighborhood in a hospital room she had never seen, a woman who had asked for her name was still breathing. That thought stayed with Annie long after the morning ended. The apartment grew quieter as the medicine began to settle into Denise's system. Annie stayed beside her on the worn couch, watching the slow rise and fall of her mother's chest, counting each breath without realizing she was doing it. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood carried through the thin windows, cars passing, a distant siren, someone arguing down the block. But inside, everything felt suspended, as if time had chosen to move more carefully in this small space. "You should sit down properly," Denise murmured after a while, her voice still weak, but steadier than before. "You're hovering like a little nurse," Annie shifted, tucking her legs under her. "I'm just making sure." "I know," her mother said softly, a faint smile touching her lips. "You always do." Annie looked down at her hands. They were still a little shaky. Not from the cold anymore, but from everything that had happened. The woman's face kept appearing in her mind, those half-open eyes, that faint voice asking questions that didn't seem to match the situation. Annie could still feel the grip of her fingers, light but desperate, like someone reaching out from somewhere they couldn't fully see. "She asked me my name," Annie said suddenly. Denise opened her eyes again. "Who did?" "The lady on the sidewalk." Annie's voice dropped slightly, as if the memory itself needed gentleness. "She asked where I live and who my mama is." Denise watched her carefully. "What did you tell her?" "I told her my name is Annie and that I'm yours." Annie hesitated, then added, "I think she was trying to remember something." Denise nodded slowly. Sometimes when people are hurt or scared, they hold on to whatever feels real. Names, voices, anything that reminds them they're still here. Annie absorbed that in silence. A soft knock came at the door. Both of them turned. Denise frowned slightly. "We expecting anyone?" Annie shook her head and slid off the couch. "I'll see." She crossed the small living room and pulled the door open just enough to peek out. Earl stood in the hallway. He looked different indoors, less like part of the street and more like someone who had stepped out of it with purpose. He still held his tool bag in one hand, but his posture was relaxed now, less guarded. "Hey there," he said when he saw her. "Figured this might be your place." Annie blinked. "How'd you?" "You said a few blocks," he answered. "And there ain't that many buildings around here with a busted intercom and that green mailbox out front." Annie opened the door wider. "You can come in." Earl stepped inside, careful not to track too much dirt onto the worn carpet. His eyes flicked briefly around the apartment, taking in the small kitchen, the couch, the folded laundry on the chair. Not judging, just seeing. Denise shifted slightly on the couch. "You must be the man who helped my daughter." Earl gave a respectful nod. "Ma'am, thank you," Denise said simply. He shook his head. "No, ma'am, she did the hard part. I just made a phone call." Annie moved closer. "Is she okay?" Earl exhaled slowly. "They got her into the ambulance. She was breathing when they left." "That's something." Annie's shoulders lowered just a little. "Did she say anything else?" "Not that I heard," Earl said. "Paramedics took over pretty quick." There was a brief silence, not awkward, just full. Then Denise spoke again. "Sit down if you like." Earl hesitated, then pulled a chair slightly away from the table and sat. "Won't stay long. Just wanted to make sure she got home safe." Annie looked at him carefully. "Why'd you come back?" Earl leaned his forearms on his knees, thinking for a moment before answering because sometimes people step into something bigger than they meant to. "And I wanted to make sure you didn't carry it alone." Annie didn't fully understand the sentence, but she understood the feeling behind it. "I kept thinking about her," she admitted, "like what if she wakes up and doesn't remember anything?" Earl glanced at Denise, then back at Annie. "Then she'll still remember one thing." "What?" "That somebody stayed." The words landed quietly but firmly. Annie thought about that, about all the people who had walked past, about the ones who had said she wasn't worth helping, about the man who had nudged her with his boot like she was something less than a person. And then she thought about the woman's voice, faint but real, asking for her name. "Do you think she has a family?" Annie asked. Earl shrugged slightly. "Hard to say." Denise spoke up this time. "Everyone belongs to someone, Annie. Even if we don't see it right away." Annie nodded slowly. Earl stood after a moment, picking up his bag. "I got to get back to work." "Thank you," Annie said again, this time more certain. He gave her a small nod. "You keep doing what you did today. World don't have enough of that." Then he turned and left, the door clicking softly behind him. The apartment settled into quiet again. Annie returned to the couch and sat beside her mother. Denise reached over and smoothed a loose braid back into place. "You scared?" she asked gently. Annie considered it. "I was. And now I don't know." Annie paused. "I think I'm still thinking." Denise smiled faintly. "That's usually how it starts." They sat together for a while longer, the afternoon light shifting slowly across the room. The medicine seemed to be helping. Denise's breathing had evened out and some of the tension had left her face. Annie leaned back against the couch, her body finally beginning to feel the weight of the morning, but her mind stayed awake, circling the same thought over and over. Somewhere, not too far away, a woman who had been left on the sidewalk was now in a hospital bed. And she knew Annie's name. That connection, small as it was, felt important. Like a thread that had been tied between two lives for a reason Annie didn't yet understand. She looked out the window at the street below, where people moved the same way they always did, quick, focused, distant. Nothing about the outside world had changed. But something inside her head, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift, the kind that doesn't ask for attention, but doesn't go away either. The rest of the afternoon passed in a slow, careful rhythm. As if the small apartment itself understood that it needed to move gently around Denise's recovery, Annie stayed close, bringing water when her mother asked, adjusting the quilt when it slipped, and keeping her voice soft even when she had questions pressing at the edges of her mind. By early evening, the light outside had begun to dim into that muted blue-gray that always settled over the neighborhood before the street lights flickered on. The city sounded different at that hour, less rushed, but no less restless. A car radio played somewhere below. A dog barked twice and then went quiet, and the occasional burst of laughter drifted up from the sidewalk before fading again. Denise was stronger now, at least enough to sit up without wincing every few seconds. She leaned back against the arm of the couch, a mug of tea warming her hands. Annie sat cross-legged on the floor in front of her, tracing invisible lines along the worn pattern of the carpet. "You've been quiet," Denise said after a while. Annie looked up. "I'm thinking." "I figured that," her mother replied with a small smile. "About her." Annie nodded. "What are you thinking?" Annie hesitated, then said, "When people were talking about her, they sounded like they already knew everything, like they didn't even have to check." Denise's expression softened, but there was something heavier behind it, too. "That happens more than it should." "But they were wrong," Annie said. She wasn't pretending. "No," Denise agreed. She wasn't. Annie leaned back on her hands, frowning slightly. "Then why did they say that?" Denise took a slow breath before answering. "Because it's easier if you decide someone doesn't matter. You don't have to feel responsible for what happens to them." Annie absorbed that quietly. It didn't sit right with her, but it made a kind of sense she didn't like. "She asked about you," Denise added gently. "That tells me something." "What?" "That even when she was hurting, she was still trying to understand who was helping her." Denise sipped her tea. "That's not nothing." Annie nodded again, but her thoughts didn't settle. A knock came at the door again, lighter this time. Annie stood and opened it to find Mrs. Alvarez from down the hall, holding a small container wrapped in foil. She was in her late 60s, always dressed neatly, even at home, her silver hair pulled back into a low bun. "I heard you were sick, Mrs. Alvarez said, stepping in without waiting to be invited. "I made soup," Denise smiled. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Mrs. Alvarez said, setting the container on the table. "But I did anyway." Her eyes shifted to Annie. "You're the one who helped that woman today, aren't you?" Annie blinked. "How did you know?" Mrs. Alvarez gave a small nod toward the window. "Word travels fast on this block. Earl mentioned it when he came through earlier." Annie glanced back at her mother, then at Mrs. Alvarez. She was just lying there. Nobody was helping. Mrs. Alvarez's mouth tightened slightly. "That sounds about right." "She wasn't what they said," Annie added quickly. "They thought she was homeless and causing trouble." Mrs. Alvarez let out a quiet breath. "People like to put labels on things, makes them feel safer, but it's not true," Annie insisted. "No," Mrs. Alvarez said, her voice softening. "It usually isn't." Denise gestured toward the chair. "Sit for a minute," Mrs. Alvarez did, folding her hands in her lap. "You did something important today, Annie." Annie looked uncertain. "I just stayed." "That's exactly it," Mrs. Alvarez replied. "Most people don't." The room fell into a thoughtful silence for a moment. Then, Mrs. Alvarez added almost to herself. Sometimes the difference between life and death isn't money or power. It's whether someone decides to stop. Annie felt that sentence settle into her the same way Earl's words had earlier. Not loud, just steady. After a few minutes, Mrs. Alvarez stood to leave. Make sure she finishes the medicine, she told Annie with a gentle smile. And you eat something, too. I will, Annie said when the door closed again. The apartment felt a little fuller, as if the kindness had left something behind. Denise leaned back against the couch. You see that? What? Not everybody walks past. Annie thought about Earl, about the man in the pharmacy who paid the difference without asking questions. About Mrs. Alvarez showing up with soup. No, she said slowly. Not everybody. Outside, the street lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement. Annie moved to the window and looked down. The same sidewalk stretched along the block, unchanged in shape and color, but it didn't feel the same to her anymore. She imagined the spot where the woman had been lying, the spilled coffee, the people stepping around her, the moment when everything could have ended differently if no one had stopped. Annie pressed her hand lightly against the glass. What if nobody ever told her what happened? She asked suddenly. Denise looked at her. What do you mean? What if she wakes up and doesn't know why she's alive? Annie said. What if she thinks nobody helped? Denise considered that. Then maybe one day she'll find out. And if she doesn't, Denise met her daughter's eyes. Then it still matters that you did it. Annie turned back to the window. The city stretched out in front of her, full of people she didn't know. Stories she would never hear. Moments that would pass without anyone noticing. But today, she had noticed. And she had chosen not to walk away. That choice felt small when she first made it. Now it felt like something else entirely. Something that connected her to a stranger in a hospital bed, to a man named Earl, to the quiet kindness of a neighbor, to a world that could be harsh but wasn't entirely empty of care. Behind her. Denise shifted slightly, settling deeper into the couch as the medicine took hold. Come sit, her mother said softly. Annie turned from the window and walked back, climbing onto the couch beside her. Denise wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close in a way that felt both protective and grateful. Annie rested her head against her mother's shoulder, listening to her steady breathing now, feeling the warmth she had been afraid might fade earlier that day. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, Annie held on to the quiet certainty that one moment one decision had already begun to change something, even if she couldn't yet see how far it would go. The night settled fully over the neighborhood, bringing with it a quiet that felt earned rather than given. Inside the hospital across town, however, there was no such stillness. Light hummed overhead in long fluorescent rows. Machines beeped in steady rhythms, and footsteps echoed through polished corridors that never truly slept. Elizabeth Carter lay motionless beneath a thin hospital blanket. Her body still caught somewhere between exhaustion and recovery. The sharp edges of the morning had softened into something distant, like a memory wrapped in fog. But not everything had disappeared. There were fragments, a voice, a small hand, a nama. Annie. Her fingers twitched faintly against the white sheet as if reaching for something she could not quite grasp. A nurse standing nearby noticed the movement and stepped closer. Miss Carter, she said gently. Can you hear me? Elizabeth's eyelids fluttered. The effort it took to open them was enormous, but she managed a narrow slit of awareness. The room came into view in pieces. Bright light, unfamiliar walls, the soft outline of a figure leaning over her. You're in the hospital, the nurse continued calmly. You're safe. You were brought in earlier today. Elizabeth tried to respond, but her throat felt dry, incooperative. The words stayed trapped behind her lips. The nurse adjusted something on the monitor. Don't push yourself. Just rest. But rest wasn't what Elizabeth's mind wanted. It was searching. A memory pressed forward, stubborn and insistent. The cold of the pavement. The blur of faces passing by. The sound of voices that dismissed, judged, moved on, and then something different. A child's voice, clear, urgent, staying. Elizabeth's lips moved again, this time forming a single word. Annie. The nurse paused. Did you say something? Elizabeth tried again, but the strength faded too quickly. Her eyes drifted shut, not from choice but from sheer fatigue. Still, the name lingered in the air, soft but undeniable. Down the hall, the quiet tension of the room was about to change. A man stepped off the elevator with the kind of presence that altered the space around him without effort. Daniel Carter moved quickly, his expression controlled but tight beneath the surface. He was in his early 40s, dressed simply but with the unmistakable precision of someone used to command. People in the hallway recognized him, even if they didn't say it out loud. Nurses straightened slightly. A doctor near the nurses' station lowered his voice mid-conversation. Daniel didn't slow down. Room 312, he asked as he approached the desk. Yes, sir, the nurse replied. She's stable, just regained brief consciousness. That was all he needed. He reached the room and paused for half a second before stepping inside. As if bracing himself for something he could not fully predict. Elizabeth lay in the bed, pale but alive. That was enough to knock something loose in his chest. He crossed the room in a few strides and stopped beside her. His eyes scanning her face. The monitors, the steady rhythm of her breathing. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, more quietly than anyone in a boardroom had ever heard him speak, he said, Elizabeth. Her eyelids stirred again. It took effort, but she found her way back to the surface. Her gaze shifted slowly, unfocused at first, then settling on him. Recognition came in pieces. Daniel, she managed, her voice barely audible. He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. I'm here. A silence followed, filled only by the soft beeping of the monitor. Then Elizabeth's brow furrowed faintly, as if she were trying to piece together something that didn't fit. What happened? She whispered. Daniel glanced at the nurse, then back at her. You were found on the street. Anonsis. Someone called it in. Elizabeth's eyes flickered. The memory pushed forward again, stronger this time. No, she said faintly. Not someone. She swallowed, gathering what little strength she had. A girl. Daniel leaned in slightly. What? A little girl, Elizabeth said, her voice fragile but certain now. She stayed. The words settled heavily in the room. Daniel's expression shifted, curiosity mixing with something deeper. What girl? Elizabeth's fingers moved weakly against the sheet as if trying to hold on to the thought. Annie. The name landed. Daniel straightened slightly. Do you know her? Elizabeth's eyes closed briefly, then opened again. No, but she didn't leave. The nurse stepped in gently. She needs rest. We can talk about this later. Daniel nodded, but his mind was already moving. A little girl on that street. While everyone else walked past, he looked back at Elizabeth, at the faint strain still visible in her face, and something in him hardened. Not in anger alone, but in clarity. What else do you remember? He asked quietly. Elizabeth's gaze drifted again, the effort becoming too much. But one more fragment surfaced before she slipped back into rest. They thought I was homeless, she murmured. Daniel's jaw tightened. The nurse adjusted the blanket. She'll need time. Her body's been through a lot. Daniel didn't respond right away. He stood there looking at his wife, at the woman who had walked into one of his own charitable outreach zones in disguise and nearly been left there. Left. The word echoed in his mind with a weight he could not ignore. He stepped back slowly, his expression no longer just concerned, but sharpened by something else entirely, something closer to realization. Out in the hallway, he pulled out his phone. "I need everything from this morning," he said when the call connected. "Location reports, outreach logs, security footage if there is any, and find me anything about a child named Annie in that area." He paused, listening. "No," he added, his voice firm. "Not later." Now inside the room, Elizabeth slept again, her breathing steadier now, her body beginning the long process of recovery, but the story that had started on that sidewalk was no longer small. Somewhere across the city, a 6-year-old girl sat in a quiet apartment beside her mother. Unaware that her name had just entered a world far bigger than her own, and for the first time that day, someone with power had begun to ask the right questions. The hospital hallway had thinned out by the time Daniel Carter ended his call, but the air around him still carried a quiet tension that hadn't been there before. People moved more carefully when they passed him now, not because he raised his voice or demanded attention, but because something in his stillness suggested that whatever had happened that morning was not going to be dismissed or forgotten. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and stood there for a moment, watching the reflection of fluorescent lights stretch across the polished floor. In his world, problems were usually numbers, contracts, negotiations, things that could be measured, predicted, controlled. But this was different. This was something that had slipped through every system he trusted. A woman, his wife, lying on a public sidewalk, ignored, judged, left, and the only person who stopped had been a child. The thought didn't sit right. It didn't fit into any framework he had built his life on. Behind him, the door to Elizabeth's room opened softly. The nurse stepped out, adjusting her clipboard. "She's resting again," she said. Daniel nodded once. "How long before she can speak clearly?" "It varies," the nurse replied. "She's stable, which is the most important thing. But memory, speech, it takes time. Trauma doesn't follow a schedule." Daniel accepted that, though patience had never been his strongest trait. "Let me know the moment there's any change." Of course, she walked away, leaving him alone again with his thoughts. Across the city, in a dimly lit office, several floors above a quiet street, someone else was already moving on his request. Marcus Hale, Daniel's head of operations, sat behind a desk cluttered with reports, screens glowing in front of him. He was the kind of man who thrived on details, on patterns, on putting pieces together before anyone else realized there was a puzzle at all. When Daniel called, Marcus didn't ask questions. He gathered facts. Now he leaned back slightly in his chair, reviewing the first wave of information coming in. Location confirmed. Time frame matched. He pulled up a grainy security feed from a nearby storefront camera. The angle wasn't perfect, but it showed enough a stretch of sidewalk. People passing, a figure on the ground. Marcus leaned closer. "There you are," he murmured. The footage flickered as the timeline moved forward. A few people slowed, glanced, kept walking. One figure stepped closer briefly, then moved on. Another paused, then shook his head, and left. The pattern was unmistakable: indifference. Then, at the edge of the frame, a small figure appeared. Marcus adjusted the zoom. A child. He watched as the girl hesitated, then moved closer, then, unlike everyone else, stayed. She knelt down, her movements uncertain at first, then more deliberate. Even through the poor quality of the video, the difference in behavior was clear. Where others had passed, she committed. Marcus replayed the segment. Then again, "Annie," he said quietly, testing the name. He paused the frame where she crouched beside Elizabeth, her small form almost swallowed by the size of the moment. "Let's see who you are." He opened another file, and cross-referenced local reports, EMS logs, dispatch calls. A note caught his attention. Initial 911 call from a public pay phone. Flagged as possible false alarm. Not dispatched until secondary call confirmed emergency. Marcus frowned. That's a problem. He made a quick note, his mind already building the chain of events. Back at the hospital, Daniel returned to Elizabeth's room, but did not go inside. Instead, he stood just outside the doorway, watching her through the narrow opening. She looked smaller somehow, diminished not just by illness, but by the vulnerability of the situation. It was a version of her he had never seen before. Elizabeth had insisted on visiting the outreach sites herself, against his initial objections. If we're going to claim we're helping people, she had told him, then I need to see it without filters. He had agreed eventually, trusted the system, trusted the reports. Now he wasn't sure what any of it meant. His phone buzzed again. Marcus. Daniel answered immediately. What do you have? There's footage, Marcus said. Not perfect, but clear enough. Your wife was down for several minutes before anyone intervened. Daniel's expression hardened. And then most people walked past. The words were simple. The implication wasn't. Daniel's jaw tightened. You said most. There was a brief pause on the other end. A child stayed. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. Annie, he said. Yes, Marcus replied. Looks about 6, maybe 7. African-American. No adult with her. Daniel exhaled slowly. What about the first call? Marcus didn't hesitate. She made it from a pay phone. It wasn't taken seriously. Silence followed. Not empty silence. The kind that carries weight. That's 2 failures, Daniel said quietly. The street and the system. Yes, Marcus agreed. Daniel turned slightly, looking back at Elizabeth through the glass. Find her. I'm working on it, Marcus said. We'll need to narrow down the area canvas. No, Daniel interrupted. Do it properly. Marcus understood immediately. Understood. The call ended. Daniel stood there for a long moment. The pieces settling into place in his mind. This was no longer just about what had happened. It was about what had been revealed. A system designed to help that didn't reach in time. A community that had learned to look away and a child who ignored both. He pushed the door open quietly and stepped inside. Elizabeth hadn't moved much, but her breathing remained steady. He walked to her bedside and sat down. His movement slower now, more deliberate. You found her, Elizabeth murmured faintly, her eyes still closed. Daniel still, not yet. She stayed, Elizabeth whispered. I know. There was a pause. Then, almost imperceptibly, Elizabeth's hand shifted across the blanket as if searching. Daniel reached out and took it gently. You don't have to worry about anything right now, he said. Her fingers tightened slightly around his she said, the words fragile but clear enough. Daniel looked at her at the quiet strength still present even in her weakened state. I will, he said, and for the first time since that morning. It wasn't a promise shaped by obligation or strategy. It was something else entirely. Marcus didn't waste time. By the next morning, his office had transformed into something closer to a command center than a workspace. Multiple screens displayed paused footage, zoom-in frames, timestamps, and city maps marked with colored pins. Coffee sat untouched near his keyboard, long gone cold. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, studying the grainy image of the small figure on the sidewalk. Annie. The name felt out of place in the sterile analytical world Marcus operated in. Too simple, too human. He rewound the footage again, slowing it frame by frame. The girl appeared at the edge of the screen, hesitated, then moved closer. There was a moment, barely a second, where she could have turned away like everyone else. But she didn't. Marcus paused on that exact frame. Why? He murmured to himself. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was asking because understanding that moment meant understanding everything that followed. A soft knock came at his office door. Come in, he said without looking up. Jenna, one of his analysts, stepped inside holding a tablet. I pulled additional data from the dispatch logs, she said. You'll want to see this. Marcus gestured toward the desk. Talk to me. She tapped the screen and brought up the report. First call came in at 9:14 a.m. Public pay phone. Caller identified as a child. Reported an unconscious woman on the sidewalk. Marcus already knew where this was going. And Jenna hesitated. It was flagged as a non-credible call. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Meaning operator assumed it was a prank, she said. No unit was dispatched. Silence settled into the room. Marcus leaned back slowly, so she did everything right and still wasn't heard. Jenna nodded. Second call came in at 9:18. Adult male. Same location. That one triggered immediate response. Marcus exhaled through his nose. 4 minutes approximately. He stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the city without really seeing it. 4 minutes didn't sound like much in a report. On paper, it was almost nothing on a sidewalk with a body shutting down. It could be everything. Do we have anything on the man who made the second call? Marcus asked. Working on it, Jenna replied. But that's not all. She swiped to another screen. There were multiple witness accounts pulled from nearby businesses. Most of them match the same narrative. Marcus turned back. Which is that the woman was mistaken for homeless, Jenna said. Some people claimed she had been involved in a dispute earlier, something about food distribution near a church. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, and that was enough. Enough for them to walk away. Jenna confirmed. He nodded once, more to himself than to her. Keep going. Jenna hesitated again. There's mention of physical contact. Marcus's gaze sharpened. Define that. Some witnesses said a few individuals nudged her with their feet. Jenna said carefully, testing if she was responsive. Others described it less generously. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He simply turned back to the screen and stared at the paused image of the sidewalk. A woman lying still. People standing around. No one stepping in except one. Find those witnesses, he said finally. All of them. Jenna nodded. Already started and the girl. Jenna gave a small uncertain shrug. That's harder. No direct identification yet. No school reports. No immediate matches in the area. Marcus stepped closer to the screen and zoomed in on Annie's face. The image pixelated slightly, but her outline remained clear enough. Small, steady, unmoving when everything around her flowed past. She's local, he said. Look at her clothes. The way she moves. She knows that street. Jenna nodded. We're narrowing it down by radius. Residential buildings within walking distance of the location. Focus on families. Marcus added. Single-parent households, lower income brackets. She mentioned her mother during the call. Jenna glanced up. You think she'll be in any system? Marcus shook his head. Not necessarily. That's the point. He straightened, his voice quieter now, but more deliberate. People like her don't show up in reports until something goes wrong. Jenna absorbed that, then nodded again. I'll keep digging. She turned to leave, then paused. Marcus, this isn't just a search, is it? Marcus didn't answer right away. No, he said after a moment. It's not. When she left, the room felt larger, emptier. Marcus returned to his desk and sat down slowly. He let the footage play again, watching the same sequence unfold for what must have been the 10th time. People walking, looking, deciding, leaving, then Annie, stopping, staying. There was no hesitation after that point. No calculation, no visible fear strong enough to pull her away. Marcus leaned forward, studying her again. You weren't supposed to matter, he said quietly to the screen. Not in a system like this. And yet she did. Across the city, in a quiet apartment that had no idea it was being searched for, Annie sat at the small kitchen table with her mother, finishing a simple dinner of reheated soup and bread. The television hummed softly in the background, tuned to the evening news, though neither of them was paying much attention. Denise looked better. Not fully recovered, but steadier. The medicine had done its work, easing the fever enough to bring her back into herself. "You eat slow when you're thinking," she said, watching Annie push a piece of bread around her bowl. Annie glanced up. "I'm just tired." "That's not all." Annie hesitated, then said, "Do you think she's okay?" Denise didn't need to ask who she meant. "I think she has a better chance because of you." Annie nodded, but the answer didn't fully settle her. "What if they don't treat her right?" she asked. "What if they still think she's like that?" Denise reached across the table and took her hand. "Hospitals don't work that way, baby." Annie looked down. "People do." Denise didn't argue. Instead, she squeezed Annie's hand gently. "Then it's a good thing you showed them something different." Annie looked up again, her eyes searching. "Do you think she'll remember me?" Denise smiled faintly. "If she does, it'll be because you stayed." The same words echoing again. Annie leaned back in her chair, letting that thought settle. Somewhere out there, a woman knew her name. And somewhere else, people were starting to ask questions. The city, which had ignored the moment when it mattered most, was beginning slowly, quietly to look back at it. And this time, it wasn't looking away. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of slow, pale light that crept through the edges of the curtains without asking permission. Annie woke before her mother did, her eyes opening to the familiar ceiling, but her mind already somewhere else. For a few seconds, she lay still, listening to the soft hum of the apartment and the distant sounds of the street below. Then it came back to her all at once. The sidewalk, the woman, the name, Annie. She sat up slowly, pulling the thin blanket aside and glancing toward the couch. Denise was still asleep, her breathing steady now, her face no longer flushed with fever. That alone gave Annie a quiet sense of relief. The medicine had worked. At least one part of yesterday had ended the way it should, but not all of it. Annie slipped off the bed and padded into the kitchen, her bare feet soft against the worn floor. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window. Looking out at the street below, morning was beginning again, just like any other day. People walked with purpose. Cars rolled past. A man unlocked the door to the corner store. Nothing about the outside world showed that anything unusual had happened there just hours before. But Annie saw it differently now. Her eyes drifted to the stretch of sidewalk where it had all taken place. From up here, it looked smaller, less important, just another piece of concrete in a long line of them. But she knew better. She had been there. She had seen what others chose not to. Already up, Denise's voice came softly from behind her. Annie turned. "Yeah." Denise walked slowly into the kitchen, still a little unsteady, but much improved. "You should have slept more." "I'm not tired," Annie said, though that wasn't entirely true. Denise studied her for a moment, then followed her gaze to the window. "You're looking for her." Annie didn't deny it. "I just keep thinking about it." Denise leaned against the counter. "That's normal. What if she's trying to remember?" Annie asked. "Like, what if she's asking where she is and nobody tells her what really happened?" Denise considered that. "Hospitals usually keep track of things, but not everything," Annie said quietly. That was harder to answer. Denise reached for a mug and poured herself coffee. The simple act grounding the moment. "If she remembers anything," she said gently, "it'll be what mattered most." Annie looked down at her hands. "You think that's me?" Denise didn't hesitate. "I do." Annie absorbed that, though she wasn't sure how to carry it yet. Across the city, Marcus Hale sat in the same position he had been in for the past 2 hours, staring at a different screen now. The footage had given him a starting point. The reports had filled in some of the gaps. But the most important piece, the identity of the girl, was still just out of reach. He had narrowed the search area significantly. A cluster of residential buildings within walking distance. Several possible matches based on age and demographic, but none confirmed. He tapped his pen lightly against the desk, thinking. "Run the audio again," he said without looking up. Jenna, seated at the adjacent station, pulled up the dispatch recording. The line crackled softly before Annie's voice came through, small, urgent, unmistakably real. "There's a lady on the sidewalk and she can't get up." Marcus listened carefully, not just to the words, but to the background. The faint noise of traffic, a distant train, the metallic echo of the pay-phone booth. He closed his eyes for a moment, mapping it mentally. "She's close to the intersection," he said. "Hear that?" Jenna nodded. "Train line elevated." "Exactly. That narrows it further." He opened a map and overlaid transit routes, focusing on the sections where the line ran above street level near older payphone installations. "There," he said, pointing. "That corridor." Jenna leaned in. "That cuts the search area in half." "Good," Marcus replied. "Now we go building by building if we have to." He paused, then added more quietly. "She didn't leave. We don't either." Back in the apartment, Annie finished her water and reached for a piece of bread from the counter. She wasn't very hungry, but eating felt like something she was supposed to do, something normal. "Are you going out today?" Denise asked. Annie shrugged. "Maybe." "Stay close," Denise said. "And come back if you feel tired." "I will," but Annie already knew where she was going. A few minutes later, she stepped out of the building. The morning air cooled against her skin. She paused on the sidewalk, looking both directions as if expecting something to be different. It wasn't. The same cracks in the pavement, the same faint stains, the same steady flow of people who had places to be. Annie walked slowly toward the spot. When she reached it, she stopped. There was no sign anything had happened there. No jacket, no coffee cup, no crowd, just empty space where something important had taken place. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what she had expected. Maybe a mark, maybe a reminder. Instead, the city had erased it. Annie looked down, then crouched briefly, placing her hand against the cold concrete. It felt ordinary, solid, unchanged, but she knew. "That's where it was," a voice said behind her. Annie turned. Earl stood a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets. "You came back," he added. Annie nodded. "I wanted to see." Earl stepped closer, glancing down at the same spot. "Funny thing about places like this," he said. "They don't hold on to what happens. People do." Annie looked up at him. "Do you think she's okay?" Earl shrugged slightly. "I think she had a fighting chance. That's more than she had before you showed up." Annie let that settle. Earl studied her for a moment. "You thinking about her a lot?" "Yeah," he nodded. "That don't go away quick." Annie shifted her weight, looking down again. "I wish I knew where she was." Earl didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Sometimes not knowing keeps you honest." Annie frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means you didn't help her because you expected anything back." He said, "You helped because it was right." Annie thought about that. Then she looked up at the street again. At the people walking past, at the same patterns repeating. "But what if she's looking for me?" she asked quietly. Earl met her eyes. "Then she'll find you across the city." Marcus leaned forward as a new piece of data appeared on his screen. A building registry within the narrowed zone. "Got something," Jenna said. Marcus's eyes sharpened. "Let's see it." The search was getting closer, and neither side knew just how close they were to meeting. Marcus didn't speak for several seconds as the new data settled onto the screen. A list of residential buildings appeared, narrowed down to a tight cluster around the intersection. Names, unit counts, occupancy estimates, maintenance logs. Each line a possible doorway to the answer he had been chasing since the night before. Jenna leaned forward slightly. We filtered by radius, age demographics, and utility usage patterns. Families with children under 10. That's the best match we've got without direct identification. Marcus scanned the list, his eyes moving quickly but deliberately. How many? 17 buildings. Jenna said about 60. 2 possible units. Marcus nodded. Once too many. He zoomed in further, layering in additional data. School bus routes, local clinic visits, public assistance records. Not to invade, but to refine, to find the smallest trace that might lead them closer. Cross-reference with pharmacy locations, he said. Jenna blinked. Pharmacy. Marcus didn't look up. She mentioned her mother was sick. She was on her way to get medicine. That's why she was there in the first place. Jenna's expression shifted as the logic clicked. Right. She began typing quickly, pulling up nearby pharmacies within walking distance of the incident site. 3 locations appeared. Marcus pointed. Focus on the one closest to the pay phone. Jenna adjusted the filter. That narrows it down to 8 buildings. Marcus exhaled slowly. Better. He leaned back in his chair, not relaxing, but recalibrating. We're close. Across the city, Annie stood with Earl a moment longer before the silence between them settled into something comfortable. The morning had grown brighter, the sun pushing through the gray just enough to cast faint shadows along the street. You heading somewhere? Earl asked. Annie shrugged. Not really. He nodded. That's okay, too. Annie looked down the block again, then back at him. Do you think she's in a hospital far away? Earl considered it. Could be close. Ambulances don't always go far unless they have to. Annie nodded slowly. That meant the woman might still be somewhere in the same part of the city. Not gone, not unreachable. That thought stayed with her. I'm going to walk a little, she said. Earl didn't stop her. Stay where people can see you. I will. She started down the sidewalk, not toward the pharmacy this time. Not toward home either, but just forward. Her steps were slower now, thoughtful rather than urgent. Every passing face caught her attention in a way it hadn't before. Every stranger felt like a possibility. Somewhere that woman was awake. Somewhere she might be remembering inside the hospital. Elizabeth stirred again, her consciousness returning in clearer fragments than before. The room came into focus more easily this time. The light felt less harsh. The sounds more defined. She turned her head slightly. Daniel was there. He hadn't left. You're still here, she said, her voice faint but steadier. He gave a small nod. I said I would be. Elizabeth studied him for a moment, then closed her eyes briefly as if gathering strength. Did you find her? Daniel hesitated just for a second. We're looking. Elizabeth opened her eyes again. She stayed with me. I know she didn't have to, Elizabeth said, her gaze drifting slightly. No one else did. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We're going to fix that. Elizabeth turned her eyes back to him, searching. Fix what? He didn't answer immediately, because the truth was larger than one sentence. The way things work, he said finally. Elizabeth held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave the faintest nod. It was an agreement. It was understanding. Back in the office, Marcus stood now, pacing slowly as he reviewed the narrowed list again. 8 buildings, 8 possible places where Annie might live. Start with the closest, he said. Jenna looked up. You want to send someone? Marcus shook his head. Not yet. We do this carefully. He paused, then added. No pressure. No attention, just confirmation. Jenna nodded. Understood. Marcus moved back to the screen and zoomed in on the first building. An aging structure, low-income units, high turnover rate. Begin there, he said. Jenna began pulling records. Minutes passed. Then she spoke again. We might have something. Marcus turned. Unit 3B, she said. Single mother. Name Denise. One child, female, age 6. Marcus stepped closer, his focus narrowing completely. Any school records? Not yet, but utility usage matches. And there was a pharmacy transaction logged yesterday morning within the time window. Marcus didn't move for a moment, then quietly. That's her. Jenna looked up. You sure? Marcus nodded once. I am. He stared at the address on the screen. Not with triumph, but with something closer to responsibility. We don't go in like this as business, he said. No suits, no announcements. Jenna tilted her head slightly. Then how? Marcus thought for a moment. Like people, he said across the neighborhood. Annie had made her way back toward her building, her thoughts still circling the same quiet question. What happens after you help someone? She slowed near the entrance, glancing once more down the street as if expecting something to appear. Nothing did. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Upstairs, Denise was sitting up now, looking stronger than she had that morning. When Annie entered, she smiled faintly. You didn't go far, she said. Annie shook her head. I didn't need to. Denise studied her for a moment. You're still thinking about it? Yeah. Denise nodded. That means it mattered. Annie walked over and sat beside her. What if something comes from it? Denise raised an eyebrow slightly. Like what? I don't know, Annie admitted. Just something. Denise smiled gently. Sometimes things don't come back to you right away. But that doesn't mean they don't come at all. Annie leaned back slightly, letting that settle. Outside, a car slowed briefly near the building before continuing on. Far across the city, Marcus closed the file and reached for his coat. It was time to stop searching and start knocking. Marcus chose not to bring a driver. It wasn't a calculated move so much as an instinct. Something about the situation resisted the usual layers of distance and formality that came with his position. No black car idling at the curb, no assistant clearing the way, just a quiet decision to go himself. Without noise, without expectation. The city looked different from behind the wheel when he wasn't thinking about schedules or meetings. Blocks passed that he normally would never notice. Buildings that didn't make it into reports, streets that existed outside of balance sheets and development plans. He followed the address carefully, slowing as he turned onto the narrower street Marcus had studied, only through maps and data hours before. Now it was real. Weathered brick, faded paint, a row of mailboxes near the entrance, one hanging slightly loose, the kind of place people passed without thinking twice. He parked along the curb and sat there for a moment, not hesitation, adjustment. Then he stepped out. Upstairs, Annie was sitting at the small kitchen table again, a pencil in her hand, though she hadn't written anything in several minutes. She had been tracing shapes on a scrap of paper. Not really drawing, just keeping her hands busy while her mind stayed elsewhere. Denise was standing at the sink, rinsing out a cup. Her movements slow but steady. The improvement was clear now. Not full strength, but enough to stand. Enough to function. You're quiet again, Denise said without turning. I'm thinking, Annie replied. I know. A knock came at the door. Both of them paused. Annie looked up. Denise turned slightly, frowning. We expecting someone? She asked. Annie shook her head. The knock came again. Not loud, not impatient. Just certain. I'll get it, Annie said, sliding off the chair. Denise didn't stop her, but her eyes followed closely. Annie walked to the door and pulled it open. For a second, she didn't recognize him. Marcus didn't look like someone who belonged in this hallway. but he also didn't look out of place in a way that felt threatening. He stood with a quiet composure, dressed simply, no suit jacket, no tie, just a dark coat, and an expression that seemed more thoughtful than imposing. "Hi," he said. Annie blinked. "Hi." Marcus studied her for a brief moment. Not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that confirmed something he already knew. "Are you Annie?" he asked. She hesitated. Denise's voice came from behind her, firmer. "Now, who's asking?" Marcus lifted his gaze slightly, meeting Denise's eyes past Annie's shoulder. "My name is Marcus Hale. I'm here because of what happened yesterday morning." The room shifted. Annie's grip on the door tightened just a little. Denise stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on Annie's shoulder before looking at Marcus again. "What about it?" Marcus didn't rush his answer. "You helped someone. A woman who collapsed on the sidewalk." Annie felt her chest tighten. "Is she okay?" Marcus looked at her directly. "She's alive." The words landed with weight. Annie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Denise's posture softened just slightly, but her caution remained. "And how do you know that?" Marcus paused for a fraction of a second, then said, "Because she's my employer's wife." Silence followed. Not confusion, not disbelief, just the kind of silence that comes when something unexpected reshapes the moment. Annie blinked. "What?" Marcus kept his tone steady. "Her name is Elizabeth Carter." The name meant nothing to Annie. But the way he said it made it feel important. "She remembers you," Marcus added. That changed everything. Annie's eyes widened. "She does. She asked for you," Marcus said by name. Denise glanced down at Annie, then back at Marcus. "What exactly is this about?" Marcus stepped slightly back from the doorway, giving space rather than taking it. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because what your daughter did matters." Denise studied him carefully. People say that sometimes when they want something, Marcus accepted that without resistance. "That's fair." He reached into his coat and pulled out a simple card, holding it out but not stepping closer. "You can check who I am." Denise didn't take it immediately. "And if I don't, then I leave," Marcus said. "And you'll still know that the woman Annie helped is recovering." Annie looked up at her mother. "Mom." Denise hesitated, then took the card. Her eyes moved over it briefly, reading the name, the company, the contact information. Her expression changed slightly. "Not fully, but enough." "You said she remembers her," Denise said. Marcus nodded. "She remembers that Annie stayed when no one else did." Annie lowered her eyes for a moment, the memory returning with quiet force. "I told her my name," she said softly. "Yes," Marcus replied. "You did." There was another pause. Then Annie looked up again. "Can I see her?" The question hung in the air. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Denise. "That's not my decision," he said. Denise crossed her arms slightly, protective, but not closed. What would happen if she did? Marcus chose his words carefully. She would see someone who made a difference. Denise studied him, weighing more than just the words. "And what would you get out of it?" Marcus didn't deflect clarity. That answer surprised her. "About what?" she asked. Marcus met her gaze. "About whether the world still works the way we think it does." The honesty of it shifted something in the room. Annie looked between them, not fully understanding the layers beneath the conversation, but sensing its importance. "I just want to know she's okay," she said. Marcus nodded once. "She is. And she wants to know you're okay, too." Denise exhaled slowly. The morning, the sidewalk, the fear, the uncertainty, it all seemed to gather again in that small apartment. But this time, it wasn't unresolved. It was moving somewhere. Finally, Denise spoke. "We'll think about it," she said. Marcus accepted that immediately. "That's all I'm asking." He stepped back from the doorway. "But before I go," he added, looking at Annie. "There's one thing you should know." Annie looked up. Marcus's voice softened just slightly. "You were the only one who didn't walk away." The words didn't feel like praise. They felt like truth. And Annie, standing in that doorway, understood that whatever had started on that sidewalk wasn't over yet. Marcus didn't leave immediately. He stepped back into the hallway, giving the door space to close, but he remained there for a moment longer than necessary, as if the weight of what had just happened needed somewhere to settle. Inside the apartment, the air had shifted. He could feel it even through the thin barrier of the door. This wasn't a transaction. It wasn't a negotiation. It was something far less predictable. After a few seconds, he turned and walked down the hall, his footsteps quiet against the worn floor. When he reached the stairwell, he paused, glancing once over his shoulder, then continued down and out into the street. Upstairs, Annie stood in the same spot, her hand still resting lightly against the door even after it had closed. "He said she remembers me," she said softly. Denise didn't answer right away. She was still holding the card Marcus had given her, reading it again, as if something might change between one glance and the next. The name, the company, the quiet authority behind it. "He didn't lie," Denise said finally. Annie turned. "How do you know?" "Because people who lie usually try harder to sound convincing," Denise replied. "He didn't." Annie absorbed that. "So, she really asked for me." Denise looked at her, something gentler in her expression now. "That's what he said." Annie moved slowly back toward the table and sat down, her mind turning over everything again, but this time it felt different, less uncertain, more connected. "She asked my name," Annie said. "And where I live and who I belong to," Denise smiled faintly. "And you told her?" "I did. And she held on to that," Denise said quietly. "That means something." Annie looked down at her hands. "I didn't think it would." "That's the thing about moments like that," Denise said. "You don't get to decide how far they go." The room fell into a thoughtful silence. After a while, Annie spoke again. "Do you think I should go see her?" Denise didn't answer immediately. She walked to the sink, set the card down beside it, then leaned both hands against the counter as if grounding herself before turning back. "I think," she said slowly, "that we don't rush into anything." Annie nodded, though part of her wanted a faster answer. "But I also think," Denise continued, "that if someone remembers you in a moment like that, it's not something to ignore." Annie looked up. So maybe Denise met her eyes. Maybe that was enough for now. Across the city, Marcus returned to the hospital just as the afternoon light began to shift toward evening again. The corridors looked the same as before, but his pace was different this time, less urgent, more certain. He stepped into Elizabeth's room quietly. She was awake, not fully upright, not strong, but present in a way she hadn't been before. Her eyes turned toward him almost immediately. "You found her," she said. Marcus didn't pretend otherwise. "Yes." A flicker of relief crossed her face. Subtle but unmistakable. "Is she okay?" "She is," Marcus said. "She's with her mother." Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, exhaling as if releasing something she had been holding on to since the moment she woke. "She stayed," she murmured again, as if repeating it made it more real. "She did." Elizabeth opened her eyes again. "Did you tell her I remember?" Marcus nodded. "I did." A faint smile touched Elizabeth's lips. Not wide, not strong, but enough to change the room. "I don't remember everything," she said slowly. "But I remember her voice and her hand." Marcus listened without interrupting. "I remember thinking," Elizabeth continued, her gaze drifting slightly as she searched for the right words, "that she didn't see me the way the others did." Marcus's expression remained steady, but something in his posture shifted. "She didn't," he said. Elizabeth looked at him. "That's why it mattered." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. After a moment, Marcus spoke. "They're considering coming." Elizabeth's eyes sharpened slightly. "Considering." Marcus chose his words carefully. "Her mother is cautious." "Rightfully so." Elizabeth nodded. "Of course, she is. She wants to make sure this isn't about something else," Marcus added. Elizabeth let out a faint breath. "It shouldn't be." "It isn't," Marcus said. She studied him for a moment, then asked, "What does Daniel think?" Marcus glanced toward the window briefly before answering. "He's asking questions." Elizabeth gave a quiet, knowing look. "That means something's about to change." Marcus didn't deny it. Elizabeth shifted slightly in the bed, wincing just enough to remind both of them that recovery was still a process. "When they come," she said, "I don't want it to feel like a transaction." "It won't," Marcus replied. "I mean it," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "No gifts, no gestures that make it seem like she did something for a reward." Marcus nodded. "Understood." Elizabeth relaxed back into the pillow. "She didn't stay for that." "No," Marcus said quietly. "She didn't." Back in the apartment, the evening had settled in again, bringing with it the same familiar sounds of the neighborhood winding down. Annie sat by the window this time, her chin resting lightly on her hands, watching the street below. The world looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. She thought about the woman Elizabeth now, not just a stranger. She thought about the hospital room she had never seen. About the moment when Elizabeth had opened her eyes and said her name. "She remembers me," Annie whispered to herself. Behind her, Denise was folding laundry slowly, her movement steady, her presence grounding. "You're thinking about going," Denise said without looking up. Annie didn't turn. "Yeah." Denise nodded to herself. "Well, decide tomorrow." Annie let out a small breath. "Okay." But even as she said it, she knew something had already shifted. This wasn't just about what had happened anymore. It was about what came next. And somewhere across the city, in a hospital room filled with quiet determination, a woman was waiting to say thank you. Not as a formality, not as an obligation, but as something real, something earned. And for the first time since that morning, Annie felt it clearly. The story hadn't ended on the sidewalk. It had just begun. Morning came with a quiet certainty that hadn't been there the day before. Annie woke before the alarm clock, though she rarely needed one, and lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling as if it might give her an answer she hadn't found yet. The decision had settled somewhere inside her overnight. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the steady way things sometimes become clear without asking permission. She was going, not because Marcus had come, not because the woman had asked, because something had started, and Annie didn't feel right leaving it unfinished. In the next room, Denise was already awake, sitting at the edge of the couch with a cup of tea in her hands. She looked stronger than she had the day before, her color returning, her posture steadier. When Annie stepped out, their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You decided," Denise said. It wasn't a question. Annie nodded. Denise studied her daughter carefully, not searching for hesitation, but for understanding. "Why?" Annie thought about it for a second, then answered in the simplest way she could. "Because she knows my name." Denise's expression softened. "Not surprise. Recognition. That matters to you," she said. "Yeah." Denise took a slow sip of her tea, then set the cup aside. "Then we'll go." The words landed gently, but they carried weight. Annie didn't smile. Not right away. Instead, she let the decision settle fully as if making sure it was real before reacting to it. "Today?" she asked. "Today," Denise confirmed. "Before we change our minds for the wrong reasons," Annie nodded. Across the city, Daniel Carter stood by the window of Elizabeth's hospital room, watching the morning light stretch across the skyline. He hadn't slept much, not because of fear anymore, but because his mind refused to slow down. Reports had come in overnight. Details layered over details. Accounts of what had happened before Elizabeth collapsed. The confrontation near the food distribution point. The misunderstanding. The way assumptions had escalated into action, and then the sidewalk. He turned as the door opened quietly behind him. Marcus stepped in. "They're coming," he said. Daniel didn't ask how he knew. "Today." "Yes." Daniel nodded once, absorbing it. "Good." He looked back at Elizabeth, who was awake, watching both of them with quiet awareness. "She's coming?" Elizabeth asked. Marcus gave a small nod. "With her mother." Elizabeth's lips curved slightly, not into a full smile, but into something deeper. Relief maybe, or anticipation. Daniel studied her expression. "You remember her clearly?" Elizabeth shook her head faintly. "Not everything, but enough." She paused, then added, "I remember how she looked at me." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth met his eyes like I was still a person. The room went quiet. Daniel turned away just enough to hide the shift in his expression. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was something more complex. Something that didn't have a quick solution. "Everything's ready," Marcus said, breaking the silence gently. "No press, no attention, just the meeting." Elizabeth nodded. "That's all I want." Back in the apartment, Annie stood by the door, pulling on her shoes while Denise checked her coat one last time. "You warm enough?" Denise asked. "I'm okay." Denise adjusted the collar. "Anyway, you don't have to say much when we get there." "I know. And if you feel uncomfortable, we leave," Denise added. Annie nodded again. "Okay." Denise reached for her keys, then paused, looking at Annie for just a second longer. "You ready?" Annie took a small breath. "Yeah." They stepped out together. The ride to the hospital felt longer than it should have, even though the distance hadn't changed. Annie sat quietly beside her mother, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving between the passing buildings and her own reflection in the window. Everything looked familiar, but it didn't feel the same. Denise noticed nervous a little. "That's okay," Annie nodded. When they arrived, the hospital stood tall and impersonal, its glass doors reflecting the world outside while keeping its own separate. Annie hesitated for just a second before stepping inside. The air was different here. Cleaner, quieter, more controlled. Marcus was waiting. He stepped forward as soon as he saw them, but not too quickly. Not in a way that would overwhelm the moment. "Thank you for coming," he said. Denise gave a small nod. "We said we'd think about it." "And you did," Marcus replied. His attention shifted briefly to Annie. "She's been waiting." Annie's chest tightened slightly at that. They walked together down the hallway past nurses' stations and quiet rooms. The sound of footsteps soft against the polished floor. Annie stayed close to her mother, her fingers brushing lightly against Denise's sleeve as if to make sure she was still there. They stopped at a door. Marcus turned to them. "She's inside." Denise placed a hand on Annie's shoulder. "You don't have to go in first." Annie looked up at her, then back at the door. "I want to," she said. Marcus stepped aside. Annie reached for the handle, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause: the hallway, the sounds, even her own breathing. Then she pushed the door open. Inside, Elizabeth Carter turned her head. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the distance between a quiet sidewalk and a hospital room disappeared completely. For a brief second, no one spoke. Annie stood just inside the doorway, her small hands still resting on the handle as if she might need to steady herself. The hospital room felt larger than she expected. Brighter, too, but her focus narrowed quickly to the woman in the bed, Elizabeth Carter. She looked different now, cleaner, rested, at least compared to the image Annie carried in her mind. Her hair had been brushed back. A blanket covered her neatly. Machines beside her hummed softly, their steady rhythm replacing the fragile uncertainty of the sidewalk. But her eyes, those Annie recognized, they were clearer now, but they held the same searching warmth. "Annie," Elizabeth said, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The name crossed the space between them and settled gently as if it had been waiting there. Annie stepped forward slowly, her shoes making almost no sound against the polished floor. Denise followed just behind her, one hand resting lightly at her back. Not guiding, just present. "You remember," Annie said. Elizabeth smiled faintly. "I told you I would try." The honesty of it made Annie feel something shift in her chest. Something that had been tight since the morning on the sidewalk. "I didn't know if you would," Annie admitted. "I didn't know if I would either," Elizabeth said softly. "But I remembered what mattered." There was no rush in the room, no urgency, just a quiet unfolding. Annie moved closer until she stood beside the bed. For a moment, she didn't know what to do with her hands, where to look, how to stand. This wasn't like helping someone on the ground. This was different. Elizabeth noticed. "You can come closer," she said gently. Annie did. Up close, she could see the faint marks of exhaustion still lingering. The careful way Elizabeth held herself. The strength it took just to sit up a little straighter. "You stayed with me," Elizabeth said. Annie nodded. "You were alone." "So were you," Elizabeth replied. Annie hadn't thought about it that way. Denise stepped forward slightly then, her presence steady and composed. She wasn't completely alone. Elizabeth turned her gaze toward her and something in her expression shifted again. Recognition of something deeper than the moment itself. "You raised her well," Elizabeth said. Denise held her gaze. "I raised her to do what's right. What she did, that was her choice." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "That choice saved me." The words settled into the room with quiet weight. Behind them, Daniel stood near the window, observing without interrupting. He had seen negotiations worth millions unfold with less significance than what was happening here. There was no strategy in this moment, no leverage, just truth, standing plainly between people who had no reason to pretend. Annie looked at Elizabeth again. "I tried to call for help," she said. "But they didn't believe me." Elizabeth's expression softened. "But there was something else there, too. Something heavier." "I know. They thought you were pretending," Annie added. Elizabeth exhaled slowly. "Yes." Annie frowned slightly. "Why?" No one answered immediately. It was Daniel who finally spoke. His voice measured, but firm. "Because people see what they expect to see." Annie turned her head toward him. "And sometimes," he continued, "they decide what something means before they actually look at it." Annie considered that. "But that's wrong." "Yes," Daniel said simply. "It is." The clarity of his answer left no room for argument. Elizabeth shifted slightly, her hand moving across the blanket. Annie noticed and without thinking too much about it, reached out. This time, when their hands met, it wasn't out of fear. It was recognition. Elizabeth's fingers closed gently around Annie's. "Not weak now, just careful." "I was trying to understand," Elizabeth said. "When I asked you those questions, I remember," Annie said. "You asked my name and where I live and who you belong to," Elizabeth added. Annie nodded. Elizabeth's eyes held hers. "Because in that moment, I needed to know that someone in the world was still connected, still real." Annie didn't fully understand the depth of that, but she understood enough. "I wasn't going to leave you," she said. "I know," Elizabeth replied. A quiet silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full in a way that didn't need filling. After a moment, Daniel stepped forward slightly, his presence more direct now, but still controlled. "Annie," he said. She looked at him. "I want to thank you," he continued. Annie shifted a little, unsure. "I didn't do it for that." "I know," Daniel said. "That's why it matters." He paused, then added, "What you did showed us something we missed." Annie blinked. "What?" Daniel glanced briefly at Elizabeth before answering. "That helping people isn't about systems or plans. It's about whether someone chooses to stop." The words echoed something Annie had heard before. From Earl, from her mother, from herself. Denise watched quietly, her expression thoughtful. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel didn't rush his answer. "Now we make sure this doesn't happen again." Elizabeth nodded slightly. "Not just for me, for anyone." Daniel agreed. There was no grand declaration in his voice. No performance. Just a quiet resolve that felt more solid than anything louder could have been. Annie looked between them, then back at Elizabeth. "Are you going to be okay?" Elizabeth squeezed her hand gently. "I am now." That answer felt complete. Annie let out a small breath, one she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the moment she first saw her on the sidewalk. Outside the window, the city continued as it always did. Busy, layered, imperfect. People moved along sidewalks. Cars filled the streets. Life carried on. But inside that hospital room, something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that mattered. Elizabeth released Annie's hand slowly, not because she wanted to, but because the moment had found its natural end. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "justice doesn't look like what we expect." Annie tilted her head slightly. "It doesn't shout," Elizabeth continued. "It doesn't announce itself." She looked at Annie with a gentle, steady gaze. "Sometimes it's just a person who decides not to walk away." The words settled deeply. Annie didn't respond right away. She didn't need to because she understood. And somewhere beyond that room, beyond that moment, the effect of that decision had already begun to move outward into conversations, into choices, into the quiet places where people decide who matters and who doesn't. This time, at least, the answer had been different. This story reminds us that true compassion is not measured by status, wealth, or social systems, but by simple human choices. In a world where many people look away, judge too quickly, or wait for someone else to act, real courage often comes from the least expected place. Annie, a 6-year-old girl, showed that kindness does not require power, only the willingness to stop, to see, and to care. The lesson is clear. Justice and humanity are not built through grand gestures, but through quiet decisions made in ordinary moments. When we choose not to walk away, we become the difference someone else desperately needs. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration.